midst of an unprecedented economic recession in the United States between 1929 and 1939, there were records of innumerable, horrible criminal sprees. From these would spring the names of notables like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, and Machine Gun Kelly. But there was one couple history will always remember for being the underworld's Romeo and Juliet. Though their reign was short, it was horrible. No business or person was safe. These two committed robberies, car thefts, and worst of all, murders, leading law enforcement personnel across many different states in their shadow and their wake. Though it has been now near 100 years since they were gunned down, their story and legacy are still known. They are gone, but not forgotten. I'm your host, Nick, and this is Chapter 23 of the Insidious Agenda podcast, the story of Bonnie and Clyde. On the 24th of March, in 1909, a little boy was born to a poor farming couple in the town of Tellico in Ellis County, south of the east part of Dallas, Texas. The boy was named Clyde Chestnut Barrow. His parents, Henry Barrow and Cumie Walker, had 7 children, of which Clyde was the 5th. The Barrows, like a large majority of families at the time, migrated to Dallas, being it was an urban center and they wanted to get away from the rural areas beyond the city limits. They were also forced to move out due to a drought that caused their farm to fail. They arrived in West Dallas, then considered an urban slum, and lived underneath their wagon for a time before finally saving up enough money to buy a tent. The Barrows were described as being very poor, but they were a tight-knit family. Clyde is described as being small and unassuming. Having a regular childhood and coming up in the public school system, his lifelong dream was to become a musician, and he desperately wanted to learn how to play both the guitar and the saxophone. Clyde would begin to have a life of crime when he turned 16 due to the bad influence of his older brother Buck. Clyde would carry out small crimes like petty thievery before moving on to things like auto theft and armed robbery. His first arrest came when he was 17 in the year 1926. He attempted to flee from the police when he was questioned over a rental car that he didn't return on time. He was arrested a second time only a short while later after stealing some turkeys with his brother. Around this period, Clyde also attempted to enlist in the United States Navy. He was so passionate that he had the letters USN tattooed on his left arm. It was a terrible blow to him when he was rejected on account of medical findings. Clyde had suffered an illness as a younger boy that is now believed to be either malaria or yellow fever. On the 5th of January in 1930, Clyde Barrow would meet a young 19-year-old waitress for the first time. The couple fell in love at first sight. This waitress was Bonnie Parker. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was also a Texan. She was born on the 1st of October in 1910 in the town of Rowena to her parents, Charles and Emma Parker. She was the middle of 3 children the couple had together. Her father was a bricklayer who passed away when Bonnie was only the age of 4. After his passing, Emma would move the family to her parents' home in Cement City, an impoverished suburb in West Dallas. To make ends meet, Emma took up a job as a seamstress. Bonnie would attend school and was described as a very good, extremely bright student. She had genuine interests in pottery and literature and would even join the honor roll in most grades she was in. She was not only mentally gifted, but Bonnie was exceptionally beautiful and someday dreamt of becoming an actress. In her younger years, it would be impossible to believe that Bonnie Parker would have become one of the most notorious criminals in history. While in her second year of high school, Bonnie took a romantic interest in her classmate named Roy Thornton. Roy was described as a boy blessed with naturally good looks. Only 6 days before she turned 16, the 25th of September in 1926, she would drop out of school and the pair were married. It might seem a bit out of place by today's standards that Bonnie got married so young, with her father gone and her mother working a hard job in a factory. It seemed like her only way out of a middling life as either a waitress or a maid. To celebrate their romance, Bonnie got a tattoo of their names on her right thigh. The marriage wasn't as picture perfect as it seemed. Roy was physically abusive towards his wife. He was also away from her quite frequently and had various run-ins with the law. Bonnie once referred to him as a roaming husband with a roaming mind. When he did return home, he was often heavily intoxicated, which was the root of her abuse. In 1929, Bonnie left Roy and the pair never saw one another again, although they never divorced. Thornton was arrested in 1933 for armed robbery. While incarcerated, he made attempts at prison breaks in various institutions. The bell eventually tolled for Thornton, who was killed on the 3rd of October in 1937 while attempting to escape from Huntsville State Prison. After running away from her marriage in 1929, Bonnie moved back in with her mother and was able to get a job as a waitress in the city of Dallas. She kept a diary in the earlier parts of that year where she expressed her thoughts of loneliness, displeasure with life in the city, and her love for taking pictures. It's worth noting that one of her regular customers as a waitress was, at the time, a young postal worker named Ted Hinton. And remember that name, because Hinton will factor into this story further on. On the 5th of January in 1930, Bonnie's path would cross with Clyde at the home of their mutual friend Clarence Clay. When they met, Clyde was 20 and Bonnie was 19, with the latter being out of work due to injury, and she was staying with a friend of hers to assist during her recovery. When Barrow dropped by to see Bonnie's friend, the two met one another and were immediately smitten. It was believed they had fallen in love, right then and there. Unfortunately, their relationship, in which the two spent countless hours together, was put on hold. Clyde was arrested and convicted on numerous counts of auto theft. Being deeply in love with Bonnie, the separation of the pair broke his heart. Bonnie's mother attempted to warn her about getting involved with the young man, however it fell on deaf ears. In an attempt to free Clyde, Bonnie was able to smuggle a gun into prison, which she gave to him. Clyde, along with his cellmates, was able to use the weapon to escape from prison on the 11th of March in 1930. Clyde and his cellmates were apprehended only a week later, and Clyde was resentenced to 14 years of hard labor and had a subsequent transfer to Eastham State Farm. For Clyde, his stay at Eastham was not a pleasant one, and he drew the attention of one of the other inmates, known only as Big Ed. Ed repeatedly sexually assaulted him. Later, Clyde would get his revenge, cornering Big Ed in the bathroom and beating him to death with a pipe. Clyde owed his life to a fellow inmate and friend who took the rap for the murder, owing to the fact he had a life sentence and would never see the outside again. This wasn't the only thing Clyde experienced at Eastham. He was starved and repeatedly beaten by the guards. Prisoners would be handcuffed to pipes for an entire day, and one of the guards was even known for killing prisoners at his own discretion, every time stating that they were trying to escape. While incarcerated, the pair began a passionate correspondence with one another. Clyde couldn't bear the thought of being away from his beloved Bonnie for another 14 years and turned his thoughts to escape once again. Masterminding his plan to get out of the backbreaking labor, Clyde, with the help of another inmate, cut off his big toe and part of another with an axe in order to fabricate an accident. Because of his accident, Clyde would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Concurrently, Clyde's mother was able to convince the judge, who oversaw Clyde's case, to parole him, rendering the removal of his toes unnecessary. Clyde's friend who took the blame for the murder said that prison changed Clyde from a schoolboy into a rattlesnake. Together with his friend and former inmate Ralph Foltz, the pair would form the Barrow Gang. Their initial goal was to eventually collect enough money and firepower that they could launch a raid on Eastham Prison. To accomplish this, they began a deadly spree of armed robberies at various stores and gas stations. In early April, Bonnie would officially join the gang. Shortly thereafter, on the 19th, both Parker and Foltz were captured while attempting to rob a hardware store in Kaufman, Texas. While incarcerated, Bonnie furthered her love of writing poetry. Later, among her collection was discovered the poem The Trail's End, in which she would foretell their fate. As a grand jury failed to indict her, she was released after only a few short months. Her defense was that she was abducted by the Barrow Gang. She would reunite with Clyde only a few weeks later. Foltz was not as lucky. He was tried and convicted, never rejoining the gang. While his beloved was imprisoned, Clyde continued his life of crime. On the 30th of April, he was the getaway driver for a job in Hillsborough. During the robbery, his gang shot and killed the store owner J.N. Butcher. The owner's wife was later able to identify Barrow from police photographs as one of the assailants, though Clyde had never left the car. A few months later, while drinking moonshine at a dance in Oklahoma with his friends Ray Hamilton and Ross Dyer, the trio were approached by Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and his deputy Eugene Moore. Clyde and Hamilton opened fire at the officers. Maxwell was gravely wounded, while Moore was killed. Moore would be the first of an eventual 9 lawmen that were killed by the Barrow Gang. On Christmas Eve in 1932, a 16-year-old childhood friend of the Barrow family named William Daniel Jones joined Bonnie and Clyde when they left Dallas that night. The following day, Jones and Barrow gunned down a young family man named Doyle Johnson in the city of Temple during an attempted theft of his car. A few days later, Clyde killed Deputy Malcolm Davis on the 6th of January. A few months later, the Barrow Gang's numbers began to swell. On the 26th of March in 1933, Clyde's older brother Buck was granted a full pardon and released from prison. Together with Buck and his wife Blanche, Bonnie and Clyde temporarily made a home at 3347 1/2 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. The hideout became notorious within the neighborhood. They were known for their loudly obnoxious card games and excessive consumption of alcohol. The Barrow family would later state that Buck and Blanche were only there to visit and to try to persuade Clyde to surrender to law enforcement. The house remained relatively quiet in the eyes of the law until one day when Clyde accidentally fired off a round from his BAR, the Browning assault rifle, while cleaning it. This incident was reported by one of their neighbors to the Joplin Police Department. The police made ready for the raid of the hideout, assembling 2 vehicles carrying 5 officers. On the 13th of April, they entered the residence, confronting what they thought to be bootleggers. Clyde, Buck, and Jones opened fire on the police officers, killing Detective Harry McGinnis and severely wounding Constable Harriman, who would later succumb to his wounds. Bonnie opened fire on the officers with Clyde's BAR as the police made their getaway. The gang piled into their car and sped away from their hideout. They grabbed Blanche along the way, who was attempting to grab her dog Snowball. Being severely pinned down, the officers would state they only fired off 14 rounds during the engagement, of which 3 hit members of the gang. Jones was hit in his side, Buck was glanced by a ricochet, and one of the buttons on Clyde's jacket deflected another. Having to leave in such a hurry, the gang left behind many of their possessions. Among these were Buck's parole papers. These would show he had only been paroled for 3 weeks. There was also a large collection of firearms. Among the things more prized was a camera and many rolls of undeveloped film, in addition to a poem that Bonnie had written titled Suicide Cell. The police developed the film and provided it to the Joplin Globe newspaper. Among the photos were the gang posing and pointing weapons at one another, in addition to the famous photos of Bonnie and Clyde, the most recognizable of which was the famous photo of Bonnie Parker with a cigar clenched between her teeth and a pistol in her hand. Even though it might appear like she did, Bonnie never actually smoked cigars, but did partake in cigarettes, which her and Clyde's preferred brand was Camel. These photos would be printed on newspapers across the United States. Like other famous criminals at the time, John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde became superstars. Over the next 3 months, their crime spree would run from Texas all the way to Minnesota, encompassing a bank robbery in Indiana, in addition to one in Minnesota, before kidnapping and auto theft of the car of Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone in Louisiana. An interesting thing with the kidnappings, as this was far from their first, was that most times they would release their hostages far away from home, but often provided them with clean clothes and enough money to help them get back. The photos printed in the paper remained in the newspapers for some time. As the headlines and continued information about the Barrow Gang's exploits continued, their crime spree would become much worse. They took part in more and more violent crimes. Anyone who stood in their way, be they law enforcement or civilian, was gunned down where they stood. Their superstardom began to erode as the public bore witness to their cold-blooded killings. They weren't able to evade notice as well as they were before. The public knew their faces. Restaurants and motels weren't secure anymore, so they were forced to cook by campfire and conduct personal hygiene in cold streams of water. They even grew to be at odds with one another, as having 5 people in one car for long hours and days created volatile tempers. Due to an accident on the 10th of June in which Clyde accidentally drove the car into a ravine, Bonnie suffered 3rd-degree burns on her right leg. This was either attributed to a gasoline-based fire or a leak of battery acid during the accident. Jones made mention she'd been burned so bad, none of us thought she was going to live. The hide on her right leg was gone. From her hip down to her ankle, I could see the bones in places. This would inhibit her from walking for quite some time, so she would either hop on her good leg or use Clyde as a human crutch. Driving through Oklahoma at the time, they were able to get assistance from a family at a nearby farm. After they were back on the road, they kidnapped a local sheriff, George Corey, and city marshal Paul Hardy. They would eventually leave the pair, handcuffed and wrapped in barbed wire around a tree. They were able to meet back up with Buck and Blanche, who were hiding in a tourist center in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The minor reprieve would give them a chance to heal Bonnie's wounded leg, but it wouldn't last long as Buck and Jones botched a robbery and caused them to have to run again. Their adventure took them next to a place known as the Red Crown Tourist Court in July of 1933. It was a populated area highlighted by 2 brick cabins joined by garages and nearby the Red Crown Tavern. This tavern was also known for being a popular restaurant among Missouri's highway patrolmen. The gang rented out both cabins and garages. Blanche, who was the least notorious at the time, rented out the cabins for 3 guests. However, the owner would notice 5 getting out. He, Neil Hauser, would also make note that the party parked in the garage gangster style. This meant that they backed in their vehicles in the event they needed to make a quick getaway. Hauser also noticed other strange things, such as the fact that Blanche paid him in coins rather than bills, and the fact that overnight the gang had newspapers plastered over the windows. Hauser would bring his concerns to Captain William Baxter of the Highway Patrol. When Clyde and Jones went into town on a shopping trip in search of bandages, crackers, cheese, and atropine sulfate, which would be used to treat Bonnie's injury, the pharmacist contacted the local sheriff, Holt Coffey, who would closely monitor the cabins from that point on. The tipping point came when he was warned off by law enforcement from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas to be on the lookout for strangers in the area who might seek to purchase these supplies. Coffey then made contact with Baxter, and the two arranged for further assistance in an armored car from Kansas City. Around 11 p.m., the sheriff and his men raided the cabins armed with submachine guns. The Barrow Gang were cornered again. They had no choice but to fight for their lives and futures. The lawmen were once again overwhelmed by the firepower from Barrow's BAR, which he had stolen a few weeks earlier from a National Guard armory in Oklahoma. The Barrow Gang was able to make their escape when a bullet hit and short-circuited the horn of the car. In the confusion, the lawmen took this as a sign to cease fire, and the Barrow Gang's car was not pursued. This escape, however, wasn't clean, for Buck Barrow was hit. He was hit so badly, the bullet blew a hole in the bone of his forehead, exposing his brain. Blanche was also nearly blinded by glass fragments in her eyes. They encamped at an abandoned amusement park in Dexter, Iowa on the 24th of July. Buck was in such a bad state from blood loss that Barrow and Jones dug him a grave. The gang were noticed by locals, with their bloody bandages giving them away. They were surrounded by law officers and over 100 spectators. It didn't take long before the shooting began again. Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones were able to make their escape on foot. Buck, already suffering, was shot in the back. Blanche didn't want to leave him to die, and the pair were apprehended by the officers. Buck would succumb to his head wound and a pneumonia complication only 5 days later in Perry, Iowa. Blanche was convicted and given 10 years in prison. Still not wanting to lay low, the gang's net widened from their usual area. Over the next 6 weeks, they would commit armed robberies in Colorado, Minnesota, and Mississippi. One big payload they hit was the robbery of an armory in Platteville, Illinois on the 20th of August, where they would obtain 3 BARs, handguns, and an incredible amount of ammunition. In early September, they decided to risk a trip back to Dallas in order to see family members they hadn't visited in 4 months. A clever thing Bonnie and Clyde did when wanting to visit family was that they would drive by their parents' houses and throw a Coke bottle with a note in it onto the lawn. When the bottle was recovered, it would give instructions on an area to meet them outside of town. The parents of both sides were not fond of one another, Bonnie's mother often blaming Clyde for ruining her daughter's life. Eventually, things would become amicable, and the two sides developed a code in speaking and writing messages. In Dallas, they would also part company with Jones, who continued on to Houston, where his mother had relocated to. The group wouldn't reunite, as Jones was arrested in Houston without incident on the 16th of November and subsequently sent back to Dallas. Bonnie and Clyde were almost arrested on the 22nd of November near the town of Sowers, Texas. A trap was laid by Dallas Sheriff Smoot Schmidt, along with deputies Bob Alcorn and, here's where he's interjected back into the story, Bonnie's old restaurant customer Ted Hinton. They waited nearby the Barrow family residence. Clyde sensed something wasn't right and kept driving. The deputies opened fire on the car with a pair of Thompson machine guns and a BAR. No family members were injured, however, a bullet did hit the legs of both Barrow and Parker. In their getaway, they held up an attorney on the highway and stole his vehicle, which was later abandoned in Miami, Florida. The 28th of November would bring a murder indictment by a Dallas grand jury against Bonnie and Clyde for the murder of Deputy Malcolm Davis 10 months earlier. This was Bonnie's first warrant for murder. December was relatively quiet, save for the robbery of a citizen in Louisiana on the 21st. The new year brought a long-awaited prison raid for Clyde. On the 16th of January in 1934, they sprung 5 prisoners, including Ray Hamilton, Clyde's friend, and 4 others, including Henry Methvin. It was dubbed the Eastham Breakout. It generated negative publicity for Texas, but satisfied what was believed to be Clyde's ultimate goal: revenge on the Texas Department of Corrections. 2 guards were shot in the escape by automatic pistols that were hidden in the ditch by Clyde. As they ran for the vehicle, Clyde covered their escape with heavy fire from his BAR. Major Joe Croson, who was shot during the escape by Joe Palmer, died of his injuries in hospital a few days later. On his deathbed, Croson was promised by Chief Lee Simmons that everyone involved would be hunted down and killed. Enough was enough. The country had been through so much from this young gang, and possibly no more than the state of Texas. The Department of Corrections made contact with former Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hamer. They pleaded with him to hunt down the Barrow Gang. Hamer was long retired but had not yet passed the limits of his commission. He accepted and was brought on service with the Texas Highway Patrol and seconded to the DOC as a special investigator. He was tasked solely with hunting Bonnie and Clyde. Hamer was described as being a man who had an inflexible adherence to right, or whatever he deemed was right. Hamer was feared and admired throughout Texas for his over 20-year career with the Rangers. By the time he had hung them up, he had been credited with over 53 kills of dangerous criminals, suffering 17 wounds in the line of fire. Beginning his pursuit on the 10th of February, Hamer became Bonnie and Clyde's shadow, always just a town or 2 behind them. Hamer wasn't able to locate the gang quick enough. On the 1st of April in 1934, Easter Sunday, a car was approached by two highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. These two officers were H.D. Murphy and Edward Wheeler. They stopped their motorcycles, believing a motorist needed assistance. Inside were Bonnie, Clyde, and Methvin just catching some sleep. They were startled awake by the officers and immediately turned on them. They were fired upon by Barrow and Methvin, gunned down there on the highway. An eyewitness to the event stated that it was Parker who fired the fatal shots. The newspapers picked up and carried this story. The eyewitness said they claimed to see Parker laugh and watched as Murphy's head bounced like a rubber ball when she shot him. Murphy was killed on only his first day as a highway patrolman. To make matters even more sad, Murphy's fiancée wore the wedding dress she had picked out for their upcoming ceremony to his funeral. The eyewitness story was eventually discredited as it changed so frequently. Needless to say, the public finally had enough. They began to cry out for the extermination of Bonnie, Clyde, and their accomplices. The Highway Patrol's commanding officer, L.G. Ferris, put out a reward of $1,000, about $22,000 by today's standards. The reward was for the dead bodies of the Grapevine Slayers. Not their capture, just their bodies. Things only became worse. 5 days after the Grapevine shooting, Barrow and Methvin murdered Constable William Campbell in Oklahoma. He was 60 years old, a widower, and a father. The gang was even able to capture Police Chief Percy Boyd. As soon as they crossed into Kansas, they let him go, complete with a clean shirt, a few dollars, and a request from Bonnie that he was to tell the world she didn't smoke cigars. Boyd was able to identify Bonnie and Clyde, but never learned Methvin's name. Thus Methvin was given the name John Doe on the arrest warrant. By this point, Bonnie had lost all form of clemency she may have been granted, being a woman, and was now seen in the same light as Clyde, a cold-blooded killer. At this point, Clyde now had 16 warrants to his name across 4 states for robbery, auto theft, escape, assault, and murder. Frank Hamer, who was still in pursuit of Bonnie and Clyde, realized he needed a bit more help and formed a posse. He was able to study the pair's movements and noticed that they swung in a circle, skirting the edges of 5 Midwestern states. This was in order to exploit the state line rule, in which no officers could cross over into other jurisdictions. Hamer was able to predict where Barrow would travel, since his movements were routine, largely centered on visiting family. He knew that next up was a visit to Methvin's family in Louisiana. Hamer didn't know at the time, but Clyde designated that as an address for a rendezvous in the event they were separated. Methvin was separated from the group while in Shreveport, Louisiana. The posse, consisting of Hamer, Ted Hinton, Alcorn, Maney Galt, and Louisiana officers Henderson Jordan and Prentice Oakley, would set their plan into action. The 4 Texans arrived in Shreveport on the 21st of May. On arrival, it was confirmed they had planned to visit Methvin's mother, Ivy, that evening. Though Bonnie and Clyde didn't know it, Methvin had betrayed them. Through his father, he provided information to the police which would alert them to the couple's whereabouts. In exchange, Methvin was offered a full pardon for his crimes in Texas. The posse set up an ambush along Highway 154, just south of the town of Gibbsland. They were in position around 9 p.m. and waited overnight into the following day. There were no signs of the Barrow gang. Around 9:15 on the 23rd of May, the posse was still waiting in the bushes. They were able to persuade Methvin's father to position his truck on the shoulder of the highway that morning in hopes that Bonnie and Clyde would stop to speak with him. They were ready to shut the operation down when they heard a vehicle coming down the road at high speed. The 1934 Ford Deluxe V8 carrying Bonnie and Clyde slowed down as they hoped. When it came close, the posse opened fire on Bonnie and Clyde. Oakley was the first to open up. It didn't take long for the posse to get the results they hoped for. Oakley's first round hit Clyde in the head and proved to be a kill shot. Hinton would later make note of hearing Parker screaming. By the time all was said and done, the posse had fired 130 shots at the car. Just as Bonnie herself had predicted, she and Clyde had met their end in a hail of gunfire. Clyde, gripping the wheel of the stolen Ford V8, and Bonnie with a half-eaten sandwich in her hand and still wearing her old wedding ring. Not wanting to take any chances, Frank Hamer approached the car and fired many additional rounds into the bodies. The gunfire was reported to be so loud that the entire posse was temporarily deaf all afternoon. When Hinton and Alcorn were asked, they gave the following statement. Each of us 6 officers had a shotgun and an automatic rifle and pistols. We opened up with the automatic rifles. They were emptied before the car even got to us. Then we used the shotguns. There was smoke coming from the car, and it looked like it was on fire. After shooting the shotguns, we emptied the pistols at the car, which had passed us, and ran into a ditch about 50 yards down the road. It almost turned over. We kept shooting at the car even after it stopped. We weren't taking any chances. One of the deputies began filming shortly after the ambush. The footage would show 112 bullet holes in the car, approximating that around 30 struck the occupants. Barrow was struck at least 17 times, while Parker was hit 26. Each of them suffered several headshots. The undertaker, Boots Bailey, would later state he had trouble embalming the bodies because of all the bullet holes. Bailey's assistant was Dillard Darby, who the gang had kidnapped only a year earlier and whose car had been taken by them. Darby recalled from his kidnapping Bonnie laughing when they found out he was an undertaker, and she asked him to take care of the gang's mortuary needs in the future. The posse recovered many stolen automatic assault rifles, shotguns, handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition from the vehicle. Bonnie and Clyde were also in possession of around 15 sets of license plates from various states. Hamer stated, "I hate to bust the cap on a woman, especially when she was sitting down. However, if it wouldn't have been her, it would have been us." Many of the posse members drove back into town to phone their respective bosses, and a crowd began to gather around the scene. Galt and Alcorn quickly lost control of what became a circus. Many who arrived began taking souvenirs, some even trying to take locks of hair, or one man who tried to cut off Clyde's left ear and his trigger finger. Eventually, with Hamer's help, they were able to get people away from the scene. The posse hooked up the Ford with the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde inside and towed it to a funeral home in Arcadia, Louisiana, which was swarmed by people within hours, including Clyde's parents. His father, Henry, was able to identify his son's body and then slumped into a rocking chair with tears streaming down his face. From prison, as he was still incarcerated at the time, Bonnie's estranged husband, Roy Thornton, had the following to say about her death. "I'm glad that Bonnie and Clyde went out the way they did. It was much better than getting caught." Bonnie and Clyde's wish was to be buried side by side. Unfortunately, this was disallowed by her family, as her mother wanted to grant her final wish, which was to be brought home. Her funeral was attended by over 20,000 people on the 26th of May in 1934. Flowers were sent from everywhere in addition to cards. Some were even reportedly from Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. The largest assortment came from the Dallas media, who sold 500,000 newspapers in the city alone. Bonnie was laid to rest in the Fish Trap Cemetery, but was later moved to the Crown Hill Cemetery in Dallas in 1945. Her gravestone reads, "As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you." Clyde's family held a private funeral at sunset the day before Bonnie's. He was buried in Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas. His gravestone only reads, "Gone, but not forgotten." Believe it or not, the American National Insurance Company in Galveston had to pay out the life insurance policies in full for both of them. Policy has, of course, since been changed to negate payouts for deaths caused by criminal acts. Even if the posse had not gunned them down when they did, it's likely that Bonnie and Clyde wouldn't have survived long past that point. New legislation made bank robbery and kidnapping federal offenses that summer, and owing to coordination between the FBI and the manufacture of two-way radios and police cars, it made robbery and murder a lot tougher to carry out. Within 6 months, the United States saw the fall of John Dillinger in Chicago, Pretty Boy Floyd in Ohio, and Babyface Nelson in Illinois. As for the posse, they were supposed to receive 1/6 share of the reward money each, which was promised to be around $26,000. Most of the organizations that said they would contribute reneged on their pledges, and each member only received the sum of $200.23, in addition to whatever memorabilia they collected. Hamer, for example, took several of the stolen guns, along with a box of fishing tackle. That July, Clyde's mother would write to Hamer requesting the return of the guns. "You don't ever want to forget, my boy was never tried in no court for murder, and no one is guilty until proven guilty by some court. So, I hope you will answer this letter and also return the guns that I am asking for." It's believed, and no record exists, of Hamer ever having responded. Other notable things that were taken were Barrow's saxophone, which was taken by Alcorn and later returned to his family. Parker's clothing was also taken, but wasn't returned when requested. Sheriff Jordan attempted to keep the car, but was sued by its rightful owner, Ruth Warren of Topeka, Kansas. One thing very evident was Barrow's love for cars. He even wrote a personal letter to Henry Ford in 1934 that read, "While I still got air in my lungs, I will tell you what a dandy car you make. I drive Fords exclusively when I could get away with one. For sustained speed and free from trouble, the Ford has got every other car skinned, and even if my business hasn't been strictly legal, it don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. The following year, in 1935, Dallas and the FBI arrested and tried 20 family members of the Barrows and the Parkers for aiding and abetting Bonnie and Clyde. This was known as the harboring trial and led to all 20 pleading guilty or being found guilty. The mothers were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment each. Other sentences ranged from 2 years to 1 hour in custody. Methvin was able to escape persecution for aiding the posse in the end. He did, however, serve 8 years in prison on conviction for other crimes in Oklahoma. As part of the Eastham prison break, Ray Hamilton and Joel Palmer were apprehended and brought back to prison. They were reconvicted of murder and executed by electric chair on the 10th of May in 1935. Jones, When he returned to Houston, got a job picking cotton, but was discovered and recaptured. He returned to prison and served a further 15 years. Jones was killed on the 4th of August in 1974 by the jealous boyfriend of a woman he was trying to help. Blanche Barrow was taken into custody in 1933, charged with assault and intent to kill. She received 10 years, but was paroled within 6 for good behavior. She returned to Dallas and married a cab driver, completing the terms of her parole in 1941. She passed away from cancer in 1988 and was buried in Dallas's Grove Hill Memorial Park. So that was their story. The tale of Bonnie and Clyde, a 2-year-long killing and robbery spree across the central states of America. It wasn't as beautiful or romantic as it might be seemingly portrayed. Bonnie and Clyde were known for their many bank robberies, auto thefts, and murders that they left in their wake. Many innocent people were affected, some losing their lives. The worst part of the whole thing, from the criminal perspective, is that Bonnie and Clyde were not good criminals. Often, they would find themselves getting pinched, located, or even screwing up routine robberies that should have been simple. They would often rob mom and pop shops or gas stations, getting away with only $5 or $10. Their biggest score was $1,500, but their average normally hovered around $80 to $150. Their story factored in everything: a tough upbringing which led to a life of crime, guns, money, and young love all helped prop up their image. When the rolls of film were released, it did nothing but vault them into superstardom in the eyes of Americans who Bonnie Parker referred to as her adoring public. They were the criminal versions of Romeo and Juliet. Their love would even spawn the ideology known as Bonnie and Clyde syndrome, which is the attraction of women towards horrible, evil men, a syndrome more commonly known as hybristophilia. This syndrome is when women find pleasure when their male partner commits a crime, anything ranging from rape to murder or robbery. There was passion in their relationship, but Bonnie was likely a hybristophiliac. Into modern days, it's Bonnie and Clyde syndrome that can be seen in the women who send correspondence to killers in prison. To sum up their lives and criminal spree, they were a twisted 1930s version of Robin Hood, taking from the rich, or even those not so well off, and giving to their families or themselves. But they never left a kidnapped person without money to get home or clean clothes on their back. Unfortunately, they also left victims who never made it home. And to close out the chapter, I'll leave you with the story of the famous gangsters themselves, in Bonnie Parker's own poem, The Trail's End, from 1934. You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There's lots of untruths to these write-ups. They're not so ruthless as that. Their nature is raw. They hate the law, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They call them cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde when he was honest and upright and clean. But the laws fooled around, kept taking him down and locking him up in a cell, till he said to me, I'll never be free, so I'll meet a few of them in hell. The road was so dimly lighted, but there were no highway signs to guide. But they made up their minds, if all roads were blind, they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer. Sometimes you can hardly see, but it's fight man to man and do all you can, for they know they can never be free. From heartbreak some people have suffered, from weariness some people have died. But take it all in all, our troubles are small till we get like Bonnie and Clyde. If a policeman is killed in Dallas and they have no clue or guide, if they can't find a fiend, they just wipe their slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. There's 2 crimes committed in America, not a credit to the Barrow mob. They had no hand in the kidnap demand, nor the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, "I wish old Clyde would get jumped. In these awful hard times, we'd make a few dimes if 5 or 6 cops would get bumped." The police haven't got the report yet, but Clyde called me up today. He said, "Don't start any fights. We aren't working nights. We're joining the NRA." From Irving to West Dallas Viaduct, it's known as the Great Divide, where the women are kin and the men are man, and they won't stool on Bonnie and Clyde. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the 3rd night they're invited to fight by a subgun's rat-tat-tat. They don't think they're too smart or desperate. They know the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday, they'll go down together. They'll bury 'em side by side. To few, it'll be grief. To the law, a relief. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. So there you have it, the story of our 1930s Romeo and Juliet, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. I really hoped you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I did researching and writing it. Before you go, remember to hit the subscribe button and leave a review or a thumbs up so you can find your way back for next week's chapter, where I'll tell the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. Also, coming up this Thursday on YouTube will be our weekly iteration of Dark Reflections, where we'll discuss this story in a bit more detail. So if you're not already listening on it, don't forget to subscribe to YouTube so that you don't miss the Dark Reflections. The Linktree and YouTube links are also in the show notes. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for listening.